So for today's video, I would like to discuss a watchmaker by the name of Ulysse Montandon. And this is not to be confused with Ulysse Montandon-Robert, who was a fabricant de horologerie in Geneva and who won many awards at various chronometer competitions and international shows. This Ulysse is a Montandon Blaiselion. He is one of the sons of Charles Frederick Montandon, who established Montandon Frères Locle. And now he was at the Paris office of Montandon Frères from approximately 1825 to 1850. And from the information we're able to glean from historical sources, he appears to have been the head of Montandon Frères Paris for the bulk of the time that he was there. Now this is a place that he eventually would cede to his brother Charles Adolphe, who within a year also departed Paris and returned to Locle as Ulysse had done. Now Ulysse Montandon lived from 1807 to 1866, and he was the eldest son of Charles Frederick. And he, with his brothers James Montandon, who was the second oldest, Charles Adolphe Montandon, Camille Louis Montandon, ran Montandon Frères Locle. And there were 5 brothers, a total of 9 children of Charles Frederick. Now, Charles Frederick and his brother David Henry were responsible for establishing the firm of Montandon Brothers in Locle. And they had been in business with their cousins in Paris, who were more or less controlling the spring, the watch and clock spring side of the business, whereas this branch of the family was specifically dealing with watch production, watch repair, and things of this variety. And now Ulysse is very interesting in that he seems to have been at a very key time in French history, located at a very interesting location. He was 1 block away from the Louvre Palace. And I would like to discuss some of the events that we find that he witnessed at the time that he was there. But he and his brothers were responsible for creating a very important watchmaking dynasty in Locle. They began in Paris, but all of the family members are eventually transferred to Locle. And there is another brother, a George Edward, and he does not appear to be tied to this watch business. It's not entirely clear. However, at least the other 4 brothers were involved in the Montandon Brothers. And now I should briefly mention the sisters. Now he had 4 sisters. And each sister appears to have had very interesting relationships with their marriages. Now, we have Adele, which is the oldest of the sisters, and she married an F. Mittendorf. And now Ulysse's brother Charles Adolphe's daughter, who I believe also was Adele, also married a Mittendorf, an L. Mittendorf. It's not exactly clear were they brothers or was this the son of Frederick, but there was definitely a marriage alliance happening there, and this L. Mittendorf would later be known to be the person who was behind Montandon Frères London office, who he was renting property at 22 Percy Street, which is quite close to the British Museum on Bedford Square. And we know that it was a very important link in the business for the London operations. Now, The other sisters, Thérèse, she actually married first Henri Dubois and later Frederick Dubois, who was a very famous Swiss writer, intellectual, and a key force, was quite well known locally. And I believe those two were brothers as well, Frederick and Henry. Now, the third sister, Sophie, she married this Henri Francois Meyrot Montandon, and he is reputed to have been somewhat of a revolutionary. There's actually a book about him, and he was somewhat radical in his political ideology. And the final sister, Cécile Charlotte, she had married a Dr. Andrier, who appears to have been stationed in Russia as a doctor, and they were apparently they were evacuated from Russia around the time of the 1904 uprising, and she died in France and is buried in Nice in the cemetery. But returning to Ulysse, now Ulysse Montandon is he was a fabricant de horlogerie, and his watches, or we do not know how he signed his watches. However, it may have been that he was signing these generally Montandon Frères, L'Ocle. Could have been under his own name, but this much is not clear. However, he was a major figure, and in the book of Les Montandons by Frederick Jules Montandon, we read the following. Ulysse Montandon, 1807 to 1866, fabricant de horlogerie à Paris, associé à ses oncles, puis à ses frères. And there's a footnote, and à Paris de 1825 à 1850. Il céda ensuite la maison Montandon Frères, 14 rue de Grenelle Saint-Honoré, Paris, à son frère Charles Adolphe, qui l'a remis après son année à François Perrenode. And this is according to, he notes the correspondence with Madame James Montandon. Now James was the other brother, the second oldest brother. So we also know that these brothers, they owned quite a lot of important real estate in L'Ocle, and this includes the Chateau de Fret and Cré-Vaillant, which is probably the most historic building in L'Ocle, and this really deserves a separate video. This property was purchased by the Montandon family, and it was a place where the Empress Josephine, Napoleon's wife, after the divorce, she took a trip to Neuchâtel and stayed at this building. And this was before it was owned by the Montandon family. However, it is a rather interesting side note, the history of this building. And this building also was a location where Frederick Guillaume, the King of Prussia, when he came to visit Neuchâtel, when it was part of his possessions, he stayed there as well. So very many interesting properties owned by this family, and it shows how rich and powerful they were at this time. Now, back to Ulysse. Now, a lot of what we know about Ulysse is coming from period sources, and one of these period sources is this book about the 1830 revolution in Paris, and this was written by a Juste Olivier, who was a Swiss language, he was a teacher, historian, a cultural person, and he actually was studying in Paris at the time, and he was friends with a person known as Henri Ladame. Now, Ladame was friends with Ulysse Montandon, and from Ladame's conversations with Juste Olivier, we have very many interesting insights about the times, about what Ulysse Montandon witnessed, and there are specific mentions of how the watch business was going at that time. And this is really interesting because in the late 1820s, there was a recession, a very deep recession, which affected business. And this whole revolution came on the backdrop of this revolution, or of this economic crisis. And was one of the main contributing factors why it was able to start up. However, I would like to share with you some of these passages from this book relating to Ulysse Montandon, and we can see how he witnessed this destructive revolution at the heart of Paris, a block from the royal palace. So let us go to the source, and I will share these passages with you.
Just a few notes from the Swiss Davoine Almanacs regarding Ulysse Montandon. Now, we do find him in the area of Rue de la Côte, which is the epicenter of Montandon watch fabrication in L'Ocle during the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And we do find him at Rue de la Côte, number 112, under Négociants et Fabricants d'Horlogerie. And he is mentioned as Montandon Aîné. This would have been after the death of Charles Frederick the father. He was the eldest son. And later, this changes from Montandon Aîné to Montandon Ulysse at the same address. Now, it should remembered that his family alliance was Sandoz. Well, his wife, he married Seraphine Sandoz. And so we do find mention of him as Montandon-Sandoz. However, there were two separate Ulysse Montandon-Sandoz, and it is not exactly clear. A second Montandon-Sandoz Ulysse is mentioned at Rue du Pont, number 218 in L'Ocle. Now, this is probably a different one. This is probably one that is related to the Montandon La Longue branch, because at the same time, in the same year, this is by the early 1850s, after he had returned from Paris, we do see at this Rue du Pont 218, and at the same time we see Montandon-Sandoz Ulysse at Saint-Georges, also Rue de la Côte 112. So clearly we may be dealing with two separate individuals, or the other option is that he had two locations in L'Ocle. This is also entirely possible. Another mention before we begin the journal entries is a note on this friend of Ulysse, this Henri Ladame. Now, he lived from 1807 to 1870, which makes him the same age as Ulysse, and they were probably school friends. It most definitely seems such. They were both young men that were in Paris at the same time, and they seem to have floated in similar circles. But interestingly enough, this Henri Ladame would go to marry a Favre, and this Favre is Augustin Favre, and once again, the brother of Ulysse, Charles Adolphe, married Louise Favre. This is a key alliance. David Henry Montandon also has marriage alliances in this general direction with Edward Fabre-Brant. Therefore, we see a very strong nexus here, and this explains a lot of the closeness of Ulysse and this Henri Ladame. So let us now look at the entries, and we have very good information. As a matter of fact, this is a very curious piece of literature. Now, this particular book, which is called Paris en 1830, journal publié par André Delattre et Marc Dinkinger. So this is the journal of Juste Olivier, and this is a very rare book. As a matter of fact, there are only 50 copies of this book. It was released in 1951, and this is book number 48 of this 50. So we're very privileged to have found this material. Now, let us go to the eyewitness testimony. And this is in the backdrop of the 1830 revolution, which was very bloody. It was a large loss of life, and it was almost a war in the city of Paris. There were over 1,000 casualties, and we find a lot of this happened over 3 days. It's so-called July Revolution, between the 27th and the 29th of July 1830. And this saw one French king swept from power to replaced by another. Now this Olivier, he is a very talented writer, and his style is very poetic. And this poet was born in the canton of Vaud in Switzerland. He had been appointed to a professorship of literature at Neuchâtel in the same year, and he journeyed to Paris to complete his studies after his appointment. Now, he appears to have kept up connections with the other native Swiss in Paris in the expatriate community, and we see this sort of situation it's very common. They're sort of a tight-knit group. So he was most probably acquainted with Ulysse, this Juste Olivier. Now, this Mercure de France publication, we find the eyewitness accounts of Ulysse based on his location at 14 Rue de Grenelle Saint-Honoré. And we let us look at the first passage. This is the mentioned on Wednesday the 28th at 8 o'clock in the morning. And Olivier is speaking about Ladame. Ladame vient de m'apporter des nouvelles. Comme moi, il a passé une nuit très agitée et n'a pas dormi, quoique tout fut calme dès les 11 heures, à ce qu'on lui a dit du moins. Un de ses amis, M. Ulysse Montandon, est venu le prendre ce matin à 5 heures, et comme il demeure dans une des rues latérales du Palais Royal, Rue de Grenelle Saint-Honoré, je crois, il a très bien vu de la fenêtre tout le tumulte. And there's an author's notation. Bien entendu, ce que l'ami de la dame lui raconta s'était passé la veille. Tout ce qui suit jusqu'au mot « il n'est guère que 8 heures et quart » donne une récapitulation de la journée du mardi 27. Voici à ce qu'il paraît comme cela commence au Palais Royal. On criait le temps, le seul journal que l'on peut se procurer. Un monsieur en tenait un exemplaire lorsque, agent de police, le lui arracha des mains et le foula aux pieds. La foule entre en fureur, poursuit cet homme qui se sauve à toutes jambes et arrive chez lui à moitié mort. Roué de corps, il était environ 9 heures du matin. Les rassemblements ont continu. La gestation a augmenté. On a fait venir les troupes. Il paraît que dans la rue de Grenelle Saint-Honoré, les gendarmes n'ont jamais pu entrer parce que des fenêtres ont lancé des pierres et autres choses pesantes. On tirait aussi des coups de pistolet. Je viens de m'interrompre pour me mettre à ma fenêtre. Il y avait beaucoup de tumulte au coin de la vallée qui longe le bord de la Seine parallèle à celui où je me trouve. On a tiré un coup de fusil et j'entends que l'on parle d'un gendarme à pied que l'on aurait saisi. Hier, il paraît qu'il y a quelques gendarmes blessés ou tués et aussi plusieurs personnes de la foule. La ligne a refusé de tirer. Comment voulez-vous, ont répondu les capitaines, que nos soldats tirent sur une foule où se trouvent peut-être leurs parents, leurs amis, leurs connaissances. Toute la journée s'est ainsi passée en escarmouches qui ont cessé à ce qu'on dit vers les 11 heures. On s'attend généralement à ce que cela recommence aujourd'hui vers les 9 heures. Toutes les boutiques avaient été recouvertes et les rues présentaient leur aspect ordinaire. Seulement, il y a un peu plus de monde dehors. Il n'est guère que 8h15 et déjà des cris et des coups de fusil se font entendre. On croit cependant que cela s'apaisera pour une quinzaine de jours parce que c'est au 15 août que le roi nommera les électeurs et sans doute qu'à ce nouvel acte, il y aura de nouveaux et de plus grands troubles. Il est certain que s'il n'y a pas un changement dans la volonté réelle, tout ne peut aller qu'empirant. Et d'un autre côté, je ne sais trop comment on pourrait revenir en arrière des ordonnances. And author's note, les gendarmes ayant perdu un billet dont ils les avaient chargés, Marmont dépêcha son aide de camp à Saint-Cloud avec un avis au roi où il disait « Ce matin, les groupes se reforment plus nombreux et les plus menaçants. Ce n'est plus une émeute, c'est une révolution. Il est urgent que votre majesté prenne des mesures de pacification. L'honneur de la couronne peut encore être sauvé. Demain peut-être, il ne serait plus temps. Marmont concentra ses effectifs entre les Champs-Élysées et le Louvre. Il s'estimait contenant les points principaux de Paris. Il donnerait ainsi 3 semaines environ à la cour pour négocier. Il résout au contraire des ordres répressifs. Vers 11 heures, Polignac lui remit l'ordonnance proclamant l'état de siège. Marmont crut alors étouffer la révolution en marchant sur elle, tout en maintenant ferme ses grandes lignes de communication. Son plan bien conçu était néanmoins voué à l'échec. Dès lors, les tacticiens cherchant d'autres méthodes pour réduire les insurrections de ville, et la première expérience fut faite à Varsovie en 1831, qu'on investit au lieu de la forcer. La dame m'a dit, car je ne suis pas encore sorti, j'attends Jordanès pour aller chercher mon passeport, qu'on avait affiché ce matin des détails sur l'expédition d'Alger, pensant distraire ainsi le peuple. Il faut qu'ils abusent étrangement, a dit la dame. Je n'ose pas me rendre compte de toute mon inquiétude. Monsieur Montandon, qui est à la tête d'une grande maison de horlogerie, a dit à la dame qu'on lui avait rapporté des montres vendues depuis 6 mois. Il ne se fait plus d'affaires. Le premier jour de la rente est tombé de 4 francs, le second hier de 8. Une foule de gens armés de piques et de bâtons vient de traverser le pont Neuf en poussant des cris. La dame a entendu dire que les troupes ont mis bas les armes. On casse toutes les lanternes. Je viens d'en voir jet ruine dans la Seine. Les gendarmes dont j'ai parlé il y a un moment étaient poursuivis pour le peuple. La dame l'a vu qui courait comme un possédé. Il allait être saisi lorsqu'il est parvenu à se réfugier dans la halle de la vallée. Hier, 2 pompiers passaient lorsque quelqu'un s'écria « Prenez leur sable, ce sera toujours des armes ». Aussitôt, les pompiers tirent leurs sabres, les jetent par terre et se sauvant. On dit que le peuple est parvenu à se procurer de la poudre. Hier, il n'en avait pas. Hier, près de M. Montandon, on a enfoncé et pillé 3 boutiques d'armuriers. La dame a entendu raconter que le faubourg Saint-Antoine et la rue Saint-Honoré sont si remplis de monde qu'on ne pourrait y placer une épingle. La dame a entendu dire à sa portière qu'on parlait d'un gouvernement provisoire qui était établi. Toutes les poudres sont à lui, dit-on. Les gens brevettés, horloger du roi, libraire d'un membre de la famille réale, et blanchissent avec de mastic leur brevet et effaçant les mots, le roi, etc. La dame et moi, nous venons de voir de ma fenêtre passer un brancard où était attendu un homme qui l'ont porté à la morgue ou à l'hôpital de. Nous sommes sur la ligne de ces 2 bâtiments et aussi sur celle de la préfecture où l'on transporte les militaires blessés. On dit que les ouvriers imprimeurs vont dans les imprimeries appeler et entraîner leurs camarades et que les imprimeurs qui ne se soucient pas d'être mêlés au tumulte ferment leurs établissements et travaillent en quelque sorte en cachette. So this is our comprehension of the situation. It is very interesting to find in these mentions of the business. Now, here is specifically mentioned with regards to the watch business that Ulysse is the head of this watch business. So he was clearly running the watch making side of Montandon Frères Paris at this time in 1830. Now, the elder generation would have already returned to law club by this time, and he was working with his younger brothers, such as James and Charles Adolphe, among others. So we also see that Ladame is telling Olivier that they have, that is Montandon Frères, that the business has been so poor that in 6 months' time, almost no orders have been processed, no watches sold. And this is really incredible to hear this type of detail. But the violence with which we see under the windows of the Montandon Frères Paris establishment is just incredible. This is a first-hand testimony of the entire revolution in a nutshell. And he is relaying this to Ladame, who is farther away from the scene of the events that are unfolding in Paris. So this is a little bit of information about the events that Ulysse Montandon saw in 1830. This was in the middle of his life. He was a young man in his mid-20s, and this probably was a shaping effect on his life. We know that he was in Paris for over 2 decades, approximately 25 years, and he went back to Neuchâtel in around 1850, and by 1860 we see him already in the area of the Rue de la Côte with the other Montandon Frères. Now, he had passed the mantle of leadership at MF Locle to Charles Adolphe, and this is also specified in local documents. And Charles Adolphe remained in Paris for less than a year after Ulysse had left, and then also followed suit and set up their affairs in the Locle wing or office, if you will, of this company. So this is just a note for the record, and I hope this was of interest, and thank you for your attention.